In the dying light of 1887, Thomas Ashford raised a hammer against the one wall his father swore must never be disturbed. Behind the bricks waited a room no map had ever marked, and the silent proof of children the world was never allowed to know. Not ghosts. Not legends. Lives erased while they still breathed. 40 years of deliberate darkness. What kind of sin demands an entire family become its jailers? The answer would drag every Ashford soul into the light, and force heaven itself to reckon. The autumn wind moved through the foothills of Virginia's Piedmont like a sigh from the grave, low, restless, carrying the sweet-rot smell of drying tobacco and the faint iron tang of turned earth. It was October 1887. Thomas Ashford, 43 years old, stepped down from the carriage and felt the weight of Cedar Hollow settle on his shoulders the way a coffin lid settles on a body. The plantation had once been 2,000 acres of ordered glory. Now the fields lay half wild. The great Federal-style house, built in 1805, stood faded and proud and somehow ashamed. Its brick facade, once the color of fresh blood, had bleached to the pale pink of old scars. Tall sash windows stared down at him like eyes that had seen too much and spoken nothing. The wide columned portico sagged, its white paint peeling in long curls that fluttered in the breeze like surrendered flags. Thomas had spent most of his adult life in Richmond's merchant houses, surrounded by ink and ledgers and the clean arithmetic of profit. He was a man who believed order could quiet guilt. He had married Margaret, raised Edward, Catherine, and young James, and told himself the past was simply history until his father's death the previous winter cracked that illusion wide open. William Ashford had not died peacefully. He had died clutching the arms of his chair, eyes fixed on something only he could see, whispering the same phrase over and over, "They are still there." No one in the house had dared ask who they were. Not even Eleanor, his widow, whose mind now drifted like smoke among faded photographs and half-remembered prayers. Thomas walked the wide hallway that first evening, boots echoing on hard pine floors that had known the tread of generals, slaves, and now free men who still moved with the caution of those who remembered chains. 12 servants remained. Mrs. Eliza in the kitchen, her eyes carrying a sorrow older than the war. John the groundskeeper, who had served before Appomattox and never spoke of what he had witnessed. And then, at the far edge of the property, the 4 who lived in the isolated cottage, the ones no guest ever met, the ones the older servants simply called the others. Thomas had always assumed they were distant charity cases. Now their silence felt deliberate. Sacred. Dangerous. He began the inventory the next morning with the same meticulous fury he brought to his Richmond accounts. Attic to cellar. Every chair, every trunk, every cracked plate. He needed to know what he had inherited, not just land, but truth. Because something in the house was watching him. He felt it in the way dust motes hung motionless in shafts of light, as if the air itself held its breath. The main cellar smelled of damp stone, old wine, and something sweeter, preserved peaches and the faint rot of forgotten potatoes. Lantern light slid across barrels and shelves, but Thomas's gaze kept returning to the eastern wall. The bricks there drank the light differently. The mortar between them was newer, clumsier, the work of a man in a hurry. He remembered, suddenly and vividly, being 9 years old and asking his father about that exact stretch of wall. William's reply had come like a slap. That wall is not to be touched, Thomas. It holds nothing of interest to you. The words had carried the same finality as a verse from Deuteronomy, law carved in stone, not to be questioned. Now the father was dust. The law felt breakable. Thomas returned the following afternoon carrying a heavy claw hammer and a chisel. The house was quiet except for the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen and the low moan of wind under the eaves. He worked in silence. Tap. 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 Each strike sent fine gray dust drifting down like ash from a distant. Burning. The mortar crumbled far too easily, as though the wall had only ever been pretending to be permanent, a lie dressed in brick. An hour passed. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His arms burned. Then a small black opening appeared. A breath of air escaped, thick, musty, carrying the faint scent of old wood, lye soap, and something human. Something alive once. He widened the gap just enough to squeeze through, heart hammering against his ribs like a second, terrified prisoner. The passage beyond was narrow, the walls rough-hewn. His lantern flame trembled, throwing shadows that looked like reaching hands. At the end waited a heavy wooden door bound by a rusted chain and an ancient padlock. Thomas brought the hammer down once, twice. The lock shattered with a sound like a bone breaking. The door groaned open on hinges that had not moved in decades. He stepped inside. The room was 12 feet by 15 feet of meticulous despair. A narrow cot stood against the far wall, its thin mattress covered by a faded but spotless linen sheet. At its foot lay a small hand-stitched quilt, each tiny square a different shade of blue, as though someone had tried to sew a piece of the sky they had never seen. Beside the cot, a wooden table held a chipped pitcher and basin, both empty yet gleaming from constant care. Above it, a shelf held books worn smooth by desperate hands. Thomas lifted one, Pilgrim's Progress. The pages crackled like old leaves. He imagined a voice reading aloud in the dark, clinging to the promise that every Christian must walk through the valley of the shadow. But this valley had no exit, the whitewashed walls were scarred with charcoal marks. Above the cot stretched a crude calendar, groups of 5 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal, the ancient prisoner's tally. 47 full weeks and 4 extra days. 239 marks. Thomas's throat tightened. This was only one fragment of time. The real ledger would later reveal the full horror, 40 years. Names had been scratched deep into the plaster with something sharp. Samuel. Margaret. Thomas. Catherine. His own name etched by a hand that had never known his face sent a wave of nausea through him so strong he had to steady himself against the wall. These were not strangers. These were blood. His blood. Crude drawings surrounded the names, a garden bursting with impossible flowers, a river with a tiny boat, a distant town whose church steeple reached toward a sun the artists had only imagined. Someone here had spent decades painting Eden on the inside of their cage. Along the opposite wall lay 4 thin pallets, each with a folded blanket and a small, lumpy pillow. A wooden chest stood open, revealing 4 sets of simple homespun clothing, neatly folded as though their owners might return at any moment. 4 wooden spoons. 4 ceramic bowls. 4 tin cups. Everything clean. Everything orderly. This was not neglect. This was controlled, precise, merciless, almost loving in its cruelty. A faint draft pulled Thomas's gaze downward. A small trapdoor in the floorboards lifted easily. Stone steps spiraled into deeper dark. He descended. The lower chamber was smaller, 10 by 10 feet, a hidden kitchen and pantry. A cast-iron stove crouched against the wall, its flue cleverly joined to the main house chimney so no outsider would ever notice extra smoke. Shelves held jars of preserved fruit, sacks of flour, barrels of water. In the center stood a sturdy table, and on it lay a leather-bound ledger, its cover soft with age. Thomas sat heavily on a wooden stool. The lantern light pooled across the yellowed pages like spilled blood. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first entry was dated 1847, written in his father's unmistakable hand, precise, merciless, the same script that had once signed contracts and recorded harvests. He began to read. And in that moment, the house above him seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for 40 years, waiting for the sin to be named at last. The shadows in the corners lengthened. Somewhere far above, a floorboard creaked though no foot had stepped upon it. Outside, the wind died completely, leaving only the soft rustle of pages turning in Thomas Ashford's shaking hands. He had come to claim an inheritance. Instead, the inheritance had claimed him. The lantern flame danced across the yellowed pages like a hesitant witness afraid to look too closely. Thomas Ashford sat alone in the lower chamber, the air thick with the smell of damp stone, old paper, and decades of unspoken sin. His hands that had balanced merchant ledgers with cold precision, now trembled as he turned the first page. April 12, 1847. The children have arrived. 4 in total. Samuel, 12. Margaret, 10. Thomas, 8. Catherine, 6. They are frightened, but compliant. Eleanor has prepared the rooms. No one must know. Dr. Vance's instructions are clear: absolute isolation for optimal development. The words were written in his father's unmistakable hand, neat, controlled, almost clinical. William Ashford had always prided himself on order. Now that same order had been used to bury 4 children alive. Thomas kept reading, each entry pulling him deeper into a nightmare dressed as science and mercy. The ledger was no simple account book. It was a living chronicle of stolen lives. William had recorded everything: daily meals measured down to the ounce, fevers treated with herbal compresses, books delivered through the hidden door, even the exact tone of their voices when they asked questions about the world beyond the walls. June 3, 1848. Samuel shows a remarkable aptitude for mathematics. Margaret is drawn to literature. Young Thomas is restless, constantly questioning. Catherine remains quiet, observant. Eleanor reports they adapt well to the routine. The air quality remains a concern. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. They were not prisoners to his father. They were subjects. Specimens in an experiment no one had the right to begin. Year after year the entries continued, the handwriting steady even as the world outside convulsed. The Mexican-American War came and went. Gold was discovered in California. Then, in 1861, the South tore itself apart. August 15, 1862. The war rages outside. Cannon fire can be heard faintly on clear nights. The children do not understand the significance, only the distant rumble. We maintain our peace within these walls. Perhaps their ignorance is a mercy. The world beyond is too cruel for them now. Thomas slammed his fist on the table. Mercy? This was not mercy. This was damnation wrapped in the language of protection. While brothers bled on battlefields, while cities burned and a nation decided the meaning of freedom, for souls had been kept in perfect darkness so they would never taste it. March 20, 1867. 5 years since the war's end. The world has changed irrevocably. Eleanor insists we cannot release them. They have known nothing but this place. The world would be cruel to them, she argues. I have come to believe she is right. Though the weight of this secret grows heavier with each passing year, the moral implications are profound. The tone had begun to shift. The early clinical detachment was cracking. Guilt was seeping through the precise lettering like blood through a bandage. By 1872 the fracture was complete. July 10, 1872. Samuel, now 37, has asked again why he cannot leave. He is a man grown with the mind of a scholar, yet confined like a bird in a cage. I told him it is for his own protection, that the world would not understand. He did not believe me. I am not certain I believe myself anymore. The experiment has become a life sentence for them, and for us. Thomas's eyes burned. He could almost hear his father's voice breaking as he wrote those words. The man who had commanded servants, survived war, and rebuilt an estate after ruin now sounded small. Afraid. Trapped by his own creation. December 5, 1880. I am growing old. My heart is not what it was. The strain of this secret has taken its toll. I have made arrangements in my will for the continuation of their care, though I pray for a resolution. Eleanor will ensure that no one discovers them. The secret will die with us, as it must, for their sake and for the family's honor. The final entry was dated January 18, 1886, just weeks before William Ashford's death. The children are well. They are no longer children, but adults, their lives defined by these walls. I pray for their souls and for mine. The burden is immense. Thomas closed the ledger slowly. The flame of the lantern seemed to dim, as if even the light wanted to retreat from what it had just revealed. 40 years. For human beings, his own blood had been born into the world, then erased from it. Not killed outright. That would have been cleaner. No, his father and grandmother had chosen something far more chilling, a living death. They had fed them, clothed them, educated them, and then stolen every sunrise, every breeze, every human touch that was not filtered through fear and secrecy. Thomas sat in the darkness for a long time, the name scratched into the wall above him seeming to glow in the faint light, Samuel. Margaret.
Thomas. Catherine. His own name.
Written by a boy who had never met him. A boy who had grown into a man while the real Thomas Ashford played in Richmond's sunlit streets. The horror was biblical in its depth.
Like the sins of the fathers visited upon the children unto the third and fourth generation.
Like Cain building a city to hide from God's gaze. Like a family that had chosen to become its own God, deciding who deserved light and who deserved only the mercy of shadows. He resealed the room that night with shaking hands, replacing every brick, smoothing the mortar until the wall looked untouched. 4 days afterward he moved through Cedar Hollow like a man already dead.
Food tasted of ash.
Sleep brought dreams of charcoal drawings coming alive, gardens that bloomed only in darkness, rivers that flowed without end, a tiny boat drifting toward a town whose church bells he could never hear. His wife Margaret noticed the change. She saw the hollows under his eyes, the way he stared at nothing. She blamed the strain of sudden inheritance and his mother's failing mind.
Thomas offered only vague murmurs and left the room before she could press deeper.
How could he tell her? How could any man speak the words, "My father imprisoned 4 of our own blood for 40 years, and my grandmother helped him do it"? He tried to bury the truth the way his father had, by pretending it did not exist. But the merchant in him, the man who worshipped ledgers and facts, refused to burn the evidence.
Destruction would make him complicit.
And something deeper pulled at him, a terrible, aching need to understand why. He began to dig. First, his father's private papers.
Correspondence, financial records, old contracts.
Nothing named the hidden room directly. But a pattern emerged in the accounts: large, regular payments to a Mrs. E. Hartwell beginning in April 1847 and continuing long after Eleanor Hartwell, his maternal grandmother, was supposed to have died in 1877. The sums were far too generous for any servant. They were the salary of a jailer. He approached the older servants with careful, innocent questions about the house's history, about unusual noises, about the sealed sections of the cellar. John the groundskeeper looked away, his weathered face tightening.
Master William kept his own counsel, sir. Some things best not to ask.
Eliza, stirring a pot of stew with hands that had fed 3 generations of Ashfords, spoke more plainly, though her voice dropped to a whisper.
There were always whispers, Master Thomas. Shadows in the old cellar. Voices when no one should be there.
But Master William made it clear, no questions, no looking. She paused, eyes glistening.
Some secrets ain't meant for the light of day. The confirmation only deepened the dread.
The secret had never been perfectly hidden. It had been perfectly enforced. The hardest conversation was with his own mother. He found her in her sunlit sitting room on the 2nd floor, a fragile figure wrapped in a shawl, staring at the autumn leaves drifting past the window like dying prayers. At 71, Eleanor Ashford's mind was a fraying tapestry, yet when Thomas mentioned the payments to Mrs. E. Hartwell, something sharpened behind her eyes. "My mother," she whispered, voice thin as old paper, "she was a good woman, Thomas."
A kind woman. He pressed gently.
The payments had continued long after her death. Eleanor's gnarled hands clutched the shawl tighter. For a moment her gaze cleared with startling force.
Your father, he had his reasons. Always. Some things are best left undisturbed.
Thomas, for the sake of the family, for the sake of peace, he was a good man. Whatever you may have found, whatever questions you may have, you must understand that he acted out of what he believed was right.
If you love this family, you will let this matter rest.
The warning carried the weight of scripture and threat at once. Thomas left the room without pressing further, but the encounter left him colder than the cellar.
His mother knew. She had always known.
And in her fading mind, the lie was still worth protecting. 1 week later, Eleanor Ashford suffered a massive stroke. She lingered for 3 weeks, eyes wide and unfocused, mouth trying to form words that would never come again. When she finally slipped away, Thomas felt both grief and a terrible relief. The last guardian of the secret had gone to her grave. But secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried. While sorting through his mother's effects in the dusty attic, Thomas discovered a stack of leather-bound journals written in a delicate, elegant hand, the handwriting of his maternal grandmother, Eleanor Hartwell. The journals spanned from 1847 to 1877.
And in them, the final pieces of the horrifying puzzle began to click into place.
Eleanor Hartwell had not been merely a kind grandmother or a dutiful wife. Before marrying into the Ashford family, she had been a trained teacher, a woman of sharp intellect and progressive ideas for her time. After her husband Robert died suddenly in 1843, she had returned to Cedar Hollow with ideas that would twist into something monstrous. Thomas opened the first journal with the same dread a man might feel opening a letter from hell itself. The pages were about to reveal not only how the children had been hidden, but why. And the reason would shake the very foundations of everything Thomas Ashford believed about sin, justice, family, and the terrible mercy of God. The attic smelled of dust, dried lavender, and the faint mustiness of old leather. A single shaft of late afternoon light cut through the small window, illuminating motes that drifted like lost souls. Thomas Ashford sat on a low trunk, the stack of Eleanor Hartwell's journals heavy in his lap. He had come seeking answers. Instead, he was about to descend into the slow, methodical corruption of a good woman's heart. He opened the first journal. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, the script of a woman who had once believed knowledge could redeem the world. April 1, 1847. William has been approached by a Dr. Samuel Vance, a physician of unconventional theories. Dr. Vance believes that children raised in absolute isolation from societal corruption can achieve unparalleled intellectual and moral purity. He seeks a controlled environment away from prying eyes to conduct his experiment in human development. William, ever the pragmatist, sees potential in this, and perhaps a way to alleviate my own melancholia. I am to oversee the children's care.
Thomas's breath caught. Melancholia.
His grandmother had been grieving the sudden death of her husband Robert in 1843. She had returned to Cedar Hollow broken, purposeless, drifting like a ship without anchor. William Ashford had offered her a mission.
A holy purpose. And she had taken it.
Dr. Vance arrived with 4 children he called orphans: Samuel, 12, Margaret, 10, young Thomas, 8, and little Catherine, 6. He presented them as souls rescued from hardship, from streets or broken homes that would otherwise crush them. Eleanor, with her teacher's heart and Christian compassion, saw only vulnerable lambs in need of protection.
May 20, 1847. The children are settling.
They are bright, curious, and remarkably resilient.
Samuel possesses a quiet dignity. Margaret, a vivid imagination.
Young Thomas, a fiery spirit.
Catherine, a profound stillness.
Dr. Vance visits infrequently, providing detailed instructions on their diet, education, and psychological conditioning. He speaks of untainted minds and pure potential. I find his theories both compelling and unsettling.
At first, the entries glowed with genuine hope.
Eleanor described teaching them letters by candlelight, reading aloud from Pilgrim's Progress and the Psalms, watching their eyes widen at stories of distant lands and heroic deeds. She celebrated small victories, Samuel solving a difficult arithmetic problem, Margaret inventing a fairy tale about a garden that never withered, Catherine drawing a bird so lifelike it seemed ready to fly off the page.
But cracks appeared quickly.
By 1849, Dr. Vance's visits had grown rare, then ceased entirely.
His letters became cryptic, then stopped.
The charismatic doctor had vanished, leaving the 4 children and the dangerous experiment entirely in William and Eleanor's hands.
October 10, 1850.
Dr. Vance has not been heard from in over a year. William believes he has abandoned the project.
The children are entirely dependent on us. William has sealed the outer entrance, fearing discovery.
I am now their teacher, their nurse, their only window to a world they cannot touch.
The weight of this responsibility is immense.
Are we their saviors, or their jailers?
The question hung on the page like an unanswered prayer.
Thomas could feel the shift in his grandmother's soul as he read further. What began as scientific curiosity and maternal tenderness slowly hardened into something darker: necessity, then justification, then a terrible form of love. She taught them history while cannons of the approaching Civil War rumbled in the distance. She read poetry about freedom while they lived in chains. She comforted their tears when they begged to see the sky, telling them the world outside was cruel, full of war, disease, and men who would exploit their innocence.
July 4, 1860. The children are no longer children. Samuel is 25, Margaret 23, Thomas 21, Catherine 19. They are intelligent, articulate, and deeply aware of their confinement. They question us constantly. William maintains that releasing them now would be crueler than keeping them here. They have no legal identity, no social skills, no understanding of the world's complexities. He fears they would be exploited, ridiculed, or worse. I fear he is right. We have created something that cannot be undone. The Civil War entries were the most haunting. While the South bled and burned, while families were torn apart and the very meaning of liberty was decided on bloody fields, for souls remained perfectly preserved in their sealed tomb, safe, ignorant, and slowly suffocating in the name of protection. Eleanor wrote of fear of Yankee soldiers finding the hidden room, fear of servants overhearing voices, fear of God himself noticing the abomination they had built beneath their grand house. Yet she also wrote of tenderness, how the now adult children cared for her when she fell ill, how they sang hymns in the darkness to calm her fevered dreams. September 1, 1875. I am growing frail. My hands tremble. My sight dims. The children, now adults, care for me with tenderness. They are my family, the only family I have truly known in these later years. William is also aging, his resolve hardening with time. He speaks less of the experiment and more of their protection. The lie has become their truth, and ours. The final entry, dated March 1877, was written in a shaky, barely legible hand. My strength fails. I pray for their future. May God forgive us. Eleanor Hartwell suffered a stroke shortly afterward. She lived 5 more years in silence and confusion, the full weight of the secret falling solely on William Ashford's shoulders until his own death in late 1886. Thomas closed the last journal. Dust motes swirled in the attic light as if the house itself were exhaling a long-held breath. The moral horror settled over him like a shroud. His grandmother, educated, compassionate, a woman who had once believed in the redemptive power of knowledge, had allowed herself to become the architect of a living hell. What began as an experiment in human perfection had become a slow crucifixion of 4 innocent lives. Not out of hatred. Out of love twisted by pride, fear, and the seductive lie that some souls are too pure for the fallen world. And William, the rigid pragmatist, had taken that lie and forged it into iron chains. The names scratched into the cellar wall now carried unbearable weight: Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, Catherine. Not distant strangers. Not abstract victims. They were family blood of his blood, kept alive yet denied life itself. Fed, clothed, educated, and then condemned to a twilight existence where every sunrise was a lie and every dream ended at brick and mortar. Thomas felt the biblical weight of it all. The sins of the fathers. The Tower of Babel built not toward heaven but downward into the earth. A family that had played God, deciding who deserved light and who must remain in shadow. Divine justice seemed to hover over Cedar Hollow like storm clouds, patient, inevitable, waiting for the day of reckoning. Yet the 4 were still alive. Now in their late 50s and early 60s, they remained behind that wall, adults whose bodies had aged while their souls had been frozen in eternal childhood. The realization struck Thomas like a physical blow. He could not unknow this. To do nothing would make him the latest link in the chain of sin. To act carried risks that could destroy the Ashford name, his own children's futures, and perhaps the fragile souls of the hidden 4. He needed an ally. That night, in the quiet of the library, Thomas confided everything to his youngest son, James, the thoughtful 16-year-old who loved literature and art and whose moral compass had not yet been bent by the compromises of Southern honor. Long-held breath. The moral horror settled over him like a shroud. His grandmother, educated, compassionate, a woman who had once believed in the redemptive power of knowledge, had allowed herself to become the architect of a living hell. What began as an experiment in human perfection had become a slow crucifixion of 4 innocent lives. Not out of hatred. Out of love twisted by pride, fear, and the seductive lie that some souls are too pure for the fallen world. And William, the rigid pragmatist, had taken that lie and forged it into iron chains. The names scratched into the cellar wall now carried unbearable weight: Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, Catherine. Not distant strangers. not abstract victims. They were family, blood of his blood, kept alive yet denied life itself. Fed, clothed, educated, and then condemned to a twilight existence where every sunrise was a lie and every dream ended at brick and mortar. Thomas felt the biblical weight of it all. The sins of the fathers. The Tower of Babel built not toward heaven but downward into the earth. A family that had played God, deciding who deserved light and who must remain in shadow. Divine justice seemed to hover over Cedar Hollow like storm clouds, patient, inevitable, waiting for the day of reckoning. Yet the four were still alive. Now in their late 50s and early 60s, they remained behind that wall, adults whose bodies had aged while their souls had been frozen in eternal childhood. The realization struck Thomas like a physical blow. He could not unknow this. To do nothing would make him the latest link in the chain of sin. To act carried risks that could destroy the Ashford name, his own children's futures, and perhaps the fragile souls of the hidden four. He needed an ally. That night, in the quiet of the library, Thomas confided everything to his youngest son, James, the thoughtful 16-year-old who loved literature and art and whose moral compass had not yet been bent by the compromises of Southern honor and family legacy. James listened without interruption, his young face pale in the lamplight. When his father finished, the boy's response was immediate, fierce, and pure. "We must release them, Father. It is the only right thing to do." Thomas tried to explain the practical horrors: no legal identities, no experience of the outside world, no skills to survive in a society that had moved on without them. Releasing them unprepared would be another form of cruelty, condemning them to mockery, exploitation, or madness. "Then we must prepare them," James insisted, eyes burning with conviction. "We must teach them. We must give them a chance at life, however late it comes. To do otherwise is to continue the crime." Over the next 3 months, father and son embarked on a secret ministry of redemption. They visited the hidden chamber every day, always careful, always after the servants had retired. They brought newspapers, books about the new post-war world, small objects that carried the scent and texture of freedom, a pine cone still sticky with sap, a smooth river stone, a pressed wildflower whose colors had not yet faded. The first meetings were raw, painful, almost sacred. Samuel, now 63, carried himself with the quiet dignity of a biblical patriarch who had wandered 40 years in the desert. His eyes held an ancient sorrow that made Thomas want to look away. He spoke little at first, his voice rusty from disuse. When he finally wept, the tears were silent and profound. "I do not know how to live in the world," he confessed. "I do not know how to walk in sunlight. I do not know how to speak to people without fear. You are condemning me to a different kind of suffering." Margaret, 61, was fire where Samuel was stone. Her mind, sharpened by decades of desperate reading, devoured every new fact like a starving woman. "I will learn," she declared, eyes fierce. "I have learned everything else inside these walls. I can learn the world as well." Young Thomas, 59 and burning with decades of suppressed rage, lashed out with questions that cut like knives. "What crime did we commit that we should be punished this way?" His voice trembled with the fury of a man who had never been allowed to be a boy. "You committed no crime," Thomas Ashford answered, voice thick with shame. "You were victims of an experiment and of circumstances beyond your control. I am deeply sorry for what has been done to you." "Sorry," the younger Thomas repeated bitterly. "Sorry does not give me back the years stolen from me. Sorry does not teach me how to live." Catherine, 57, remained the most fragile. She spoke rarely, her gaze often fixed on some invisible horizon only she could see. The thought of leaving her familiar prison seemed to terrify her more than staying. She clung to the small quilt she had stitched as a child, fingers tracing the faded blue squares as if they were the only stable thing left in existence. Thomas made careful arrangements. He quietly purchased a modest, secluded cottage on the outskirts of Richmond, far enough from Cedar Hollow to avoid immediate gossip, yet close enough for him to watch over their transition. He hired Mrs. Helena Voss, a discreet and compassionate widow, to live with them and gently guide them through the bewildering maze of modern life. The day of their emergence was both holy and harrowing. One by one, they were led up the narrow stairs, through the broken wall, and into the cellar proper. Then, under cover of deepest night, into the open air.
Samuel fell to his knees the moment he felt grass beneath his feet. He pressed his face to the earth and wept uncontrollably, fingers digging into the soil as though trying to anchor himself to a reality he had only dreamed. Margaret stood motionless, face lifted to the vast, star-filled sky, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She whispered a single word over and over, "Beautiful, beautiful." Young Thomas staggered forward a few steps, then turned and stared back at the house with pure, unfiltered hatred before walking away without looking back. Catherine had to be carried. She buried her face in Thomas Ashford's shoulder, trembling violently, whispering prayers she had learned from Eleanor decades earlier. The adjustment that followed was a second, slower birth, painful, messy, full of both wonder and terror. Samuel struggled most with the sensory assault of the outside world. The roar of carriages, the endless sky, the press of strangers, all of it sent him retreating to dark corners, hands over his ears. Yet in time he discovered an unexpected gift: carpentry. The precise, quiet work of shaping would brought him a peace he had never known. He began crafting simple furniture, each piece a small act of reclaiming control over his life. Margaret's brilliant mind absorbed the new world like a sponge. She read newspapers voraciously, learned to write with elegant flourish, and eventually found work as a skilled seamstress. Her fingers, trained by years of patient stitching in darkness, now created intricate patterns that ladies in Richmond fought to possess. The younger Thomas channeled his rage into relentless physical labor in the city's textile mills. His strength and unyielding work ethic earned respect, though he remained solitary, haunted. He never married, but found quiet companionship with a fellow worker who asked no questions about the shadows in his eyes. Catherine remained the most delicate. The world felt too loud, too bright, too vast. She moved slowly, spoke little, and often sat for hours simply watching clouds drift across the sky, marveling at something she had drawn on plaster walls for decades but never truly seen. Thomas Ashford watched their painful rebirth from a distance, carrying the guilt like a second shadow. He provided money, protection, and silence. But he knew the truth: no amount of kindness could restore what had been stolen. The Ashford family had committed a sin against time itself. And somewhere in the quiet hours, as he lay awake beside his sleeping wife, Thomas wondered whether God's justice would be satisfied with their slow redemption, or whether the curse of Cedar Hollow still demanded a final, terrible payment. The transition from eternal twilight to the roaring, blinding world of 1887 was not a rescue. It was another birth, violent, disorienting, and soaked in grief. Mrs. Helena Voss, the quiet widow Thomas had chosen with care, moved into the secluded cottage on the outskirts of Richmond with the patience of a saint and the steady hands of someone who had buried her own sorrows. She taught Catherine the simplest rhythms of freedom: how to boil water without fear of wasting fuel, how to sweep a floor that was not made of stone, how to look a stranger in the eye without flinching. Catherine found a strange comfort in repetition. The same motions, day after day, folding linens, scrubbing pots, moving silently through other people's homes as a domestic servant. She spoke little. She asked for nothing. Her mind seemed to live still in the charcoal garden she had drawn on plaster walls for decades. The outside world remained too loud, too bright, too mercilessly alive. In 1912, at the age of 65, she died in a Richmond poorhouse. The official cause was pneumonia. Those who sat with her in her final hours whispered that she had simply faded, like ink left too long in the sun, unable to find a place in a world that had never waited for her. Samuel Hartwell, once the quiet eldest, now a man of 63 with the bearing of someone who had aged in darkness, struggled most violently with freedom. The first time he stepped outside the cottage at dawn, the open sky made him drop to his knees. He pressed his palms into the dew-wet grass and wept without sound, as though the earth itself might swallow him if he let go. Every sound assaulted him: carriage wheels on cobblestones, distant church bells, children laughing in the street. He would retreat to the darkest corner of the cottage, hands clamped over his ears, rocking like the boy he had never been allowed to be. Yet in that same darkness he discovered an unexpected grace. Wood. With trembling hands he began to shape timber, simple chairs, small tables, a modest bookshelf. The precise, quiet work of carpentry became his prayer. Each cut, each sanded edge, was an act of taking back control over a life that had been measured by someone else's ledger. He lived 5 years after his release. In 1892, at the age of 68, Samuel Hartwell died of what the doctor called cardiac arrest. Thomas Ashford, standing at the graveside in a small unmarked corner of a Richmond cemetery, believed it was something deeper, a heart that had never learned how to beat in open air. The man who had spent 40 years waiting for sunlight finally stepped into it, and could not survive its warmth. Margaret Vance, the girl who had once filled the hidden room with stories of impossible gardens, became the brightest flame among them. Her mind, sharpened like a blade by decades of desperate reading in candlelight, devoured the new world. She read every newspaper she could find, argued gently about politics with Mrs. Voss, and learned to write with a graceful, flowing hand. In time she married Charles Henderson, a kind widower and retired schoolteacher who saw in her quiet wisdom something rare and unbreakable. Together they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whom Margaret raised with a fierce, almost sacred emphasis on education and freedom of thought. She never spoke publicly of the sealed room. But every night she kept her own journals, filling page after page with observations of a world she had once only imagined through charcoal scratches on whitewashed plaster. Margaret died peacefully in 1921 at the age of 74, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her only as a gentle, fiercely intelligent grandmother who loved books more than almost anything. Her secret remained hers, a private victory over the darkness that had tried to claim her. The younger Thomas, the one who carried the same name as the man now trying to atone, burned with a different fire. His anger never fully cooled. It smoldered beneath every hammer strike in the textile mills of Richmond. He worked harder than any man on the floor, his body lean and strong from labor that felt like penance and rebellion at once. He never married. He formed one quiet companionship with a fellow mill worker who knew better than to ask why some nights the younger Thomas stared into the distance as if still seeing brick walls closing in. He built a respectable, solitary life. In 1928, at the age of 81, he died, a man who had carved dignity out of the ruins of stolen decades. His rage had become resolve. His prison had become the fuel that kept him moving when others would have broken. Thomas Ashford the elder, the inheritor who had opened the wall, never escaped the weight he had uncovered. His wife Margaret died not long after the discovery, weakened by the silent strain that had entered their marriage like a third presence. Thomas grew increasingly reclusive. He managed Cedar Hollow with grim, almost monastic dedication, as though every repaired fence and balanced ledger could somehow balance the scales of justice. He spoke little. He smiled less. His life became a long, quiet act of atonement, a man trying to pay a debt that could never be settled in coin or labor. In 1901, driven by a conscience that would not let him rest, Thomas commissioned Dr. Edmund Garrett, a respected historian from the University of Virginia, to write the full, unsparing history of the Ashford family. He granted the scholar complete access to every document, including William's chilling ledger and Eleanor Hartwell's poignant journals. His only condition: the book must not be published until after his own death. Thomas Ashford died in 1903 at the age of 79. Those who attended the quiet funeral said his face, in the end, looked strangely at peace, as though the burden had finally been handed to someone else. In 1905, Dr. Garrett's book, The Hidden Years, was released to the public. It exploded across Virginia and then the entire nation like a long-buried mine finally detonating. Newspapers printed sensational headlines. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of playing God. Scholars debated the limits of scientific curiosity and the sacredness of human freedom. The sealed room at Cedar Hollow became a symbol not of ghosts, but of something far more terrifying: ordinary people who had convinced themselves that evil could be justified if it wore the mask of mercy. Authorities opened a brief investigation, but by then almost everyone who could have been held accountable was already in the ground. Dr. Samuel Vance had vanished without a trace decades earlier. No medical records, no publications, no confirmed existence. The older servants were dead or too frail to testify clearly. In the end, no criminal charges were filed. The law of 1905, like the law of 1847, had no adequate language for the crime of stealing 40 years of sunlight from 4 living souls. Yet the questions refused to die. How many other experiments had been conducted in the name of progress during the turbulent 19th century? How many children, how many vulnerable souls, had been erased from the census, hidden behind respectable brick walls, because powerful men believed they knew better than God how a human life should unfold? The story of Cedar Hollow stood as a dark mirror to its age, an era drunk on scientific optimism, fractured by war, and still carrying the scars of slavery's moral rot. In isolated plantation houses, behind veils of Southern silence and family honor, it was frighteningly easy for lives to simply disappear from the record. Cedar Hollow itself still stands today, preserved by a historical society. The sealed room remains exactly as Thomas found it: the narrow cot, the faded quilt, the charcoal calendar on the wall, the small stack of books worn smooth by desperate hands. The ledger and Eleanor's journals rest in the Virginia Historical Society, studied by historians, psychologists, and ethicists who come seeking lessons about isolation, consent, and the thin line between protection and possession. For the descendants of Margaret Vance and the younger Thomas Ashford, the legacy is intimate and heavy. They carry the blood of both victims and perpetrators. Some have become quiet advocates for historical truth and human dignity, determined that the sealed rooms of history, whether physical or psychological, never remain hidden again. And yet the most haunting question lingers like fog over the Piedmont hills. How many other sealed rooms still exist? Not just in old plantations or forgotten cellars, but in the hidden corners of families, institutions, and even our own hearts, places where we lock away inconvenient truths, uncomfortable people, or parts of ourselves we refuse to let see the light. Thomas Ashford chose to break the wall. Most never do. The four who emerged from darkness taught us this: freedom is not merely the absence of chains. It is the terrifying, beautiful, sometimes unbearable ability to step into the sun after a lifetime of learning how to live without it. Some souls learn to bloom in that light. Others carry the darkness with them forever, and somewhere, in the quiet archives of history, the ghost of Dr. Samuel Vance, whether real man, charlatan, or symbol, still smiles in the shadows, reminding us that the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build while telling ourselves we are doing God's work. What happened to the four lost souls after they left the sealed room is not a story of perfect redemption. It is a story of costly grace, incomplete, painful, and profoundly human. And it asks every one of us: if you discovered such a room in your own family's house, would you have the courage to open it? Or would you choose the comfort of another brick, another layer of silence, another generation of carefully preserved lies? The walls are thinner than we think. The light is waiting. But once you let it in, there is no going back.